Um, I'm Arthur Urbano, Associate Professor of Theology here at Providence College and Chair of the Theology Department's Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee. I'd like to give a warm welcome to members of the Providence College community, the Rhode Island Jewish community, alumni, and friends. And I'd especially like to welcome today the 40 or so members of the Council of Centers on Jewish-Christian Relations who are at PC today and tomorrow for their annual meeting. The CCJR is an association of centers and institutes in the United States and Canada devoted to enhancing mutual understanding between Jews and Christians. It's dedicated to research, publication, educational programming, and interreligious dialogue that respect the religious integrity and self-understanding of the various strands of the Jewish and Christian traditions. Many of the leading scholars and voices in Jewish-Christian dialogue are here with us today. PC's Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange Committee, as a member of the CCJR, is very pleased to be hosting the conference this year. As most of you know, Providence College's Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange actively promotes Jewish Catholic engagement and understanding through lectures, dialogues, and colloquia. Established in 2009, the program builds upon PC's long-standing relationship with the Rhode Island Jewish community and the principles of Nostra Aetate. This afternoon's event comes just a few days before the 80th anniversary of Kristallnacht, and just over a week after what was the deadliest attack on Jews in American history at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh. Tragedies such as these are a sobering reminder of the moral duty to dialogue, educate, and build relationships across religious lines. In memory of those who died and in solidarity with one another, I invite you all now to take a moment of silence in prayer. The topic of today's discussion, the case of Edgardo Mortara, the Jewish boy who was abducted from his family at the order of Pope Pius IX, was and continues to be a flashpoint in Jewish Catholic relations. Even 160 years later, the affair continues to cast a shadow over Jewish Catholic relations as it raises historical and theological questions and reveals fault lines between Jews and Catholics and among Catholics, as a recent article in the publication First Things made abundantly clear. Our keynote speaker today is Professor David Kertzer. Professor Kertzer is currently the Tapie University Professor of Social Science and Professor of Anthropology and Italian Studies at Brown University. He is a prolific and Pulitzer Prize award-winning author. Of particular interest for us today is his work dealing with the papacy, the modern Italian state, and the Jews. These include his most recent book, The Pope Who Would Be King, 2014's The Pope and Mussolini, 1997's The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, which has been translated into 13 languages and is currently being made into a film by Steven Spielberg. It would be a gross understatement to say that Professor Kertzer's work has generated much discussion. It is challenging and controversial. On a personal note, as a young undergraduate Italian studies major at Brown, I took a course with Professor Kertzer on the history of modern Italy that for me was both very historically enlightening, but also personally challenging. After Professor Kertzer's presentation, we'll have two responses. The first by Professor Holly Taylor Coolman, a member of the theology faculty here at Providence College, who has also been a longtime member of the Jewish Catholic Theological Exchange. Professor Coolman's areas of expertise include Christian theologies of Judaism and Jewish-Christian relations. Professor Matthew Tapie is a member of the theology faculty at St. Leo University in Florida and director of the Center for Catholic Jewish Studies there. His research interests are in the thought of St. Thomas Aquinas, Catholic Jewish relations, and moral theology. His book, Aquinas on Israel and the Church, was published in 2014. After the two responses, we'll have some time for discussion among the panelists, and then we'll open up to some questions with a plan to wrap up around 6 p.m. So without further ado, would you please join me in welcoming Professor David Kertzer.
Thank you, Arthur, and thanks to Providence College and to the CCJR for this invitation. I'm a neighbor at Brown. We're just a couple miles away, and I think we don't get over here often enough, so it's good, among other things, to help strengthen that relationship between our institutions. Okay. That's better. Thank you. I must admit, when I first published my book on the Mortara case in 1997, so that's now over 20 years ago, I never imagined that 2 decades later, the case would continue to receive such public attention and be still today, as Arthur mentioned, the cause of religious polemics involving Catholics and Jews. Mentioned 13 editions. Actually, I think we're now up to about 20, but especially because when Spielberg announced he's doing a film, nobody really cares about books, but films. You know? So now, Georgian, I don't know. At the time I wrote my book, the Mortara case had been largely forgotten, at least outside of certain limited Jewish circles where it was known, but actually only imperfectly known. I had been particularly struck as someone who does Italian history by the total lack of knowledge of the Mortara case among Italian historians at that time, including historians from the area where the Mortara case took place in Bologna, historians of the 19th century who seemed to know very, very little, if anything, about it. The fact is, as I argue in my book, and I think others note as well, this is a case, it's not just of church-state relations or Jewish-Catholic relations, but it's a case that actually influenced the course of Italian history. As many of you are aware, the latest round of polemics came to a head just earlier this year when in the February 1st issue of the magazine First Things, as was noted by Arthur, an article called Non Possumus by the Dominican Romanus Cesario. This is how the First Things presents itself as, first of all, truth, which is a questionable category these days, and claims to be America's most influential journal. There are others here who can better judge the accuracy of that argument. But Romano Cesario is professor of theology, is Dominican, as I mentioned, and professor of theology at St. John's Seminary, the seminary here in Boston. And his piece defending Pius IX's decision to take the 6-year-old boy, Jewish boy Edgardo Mortara, from his family sparked a good deal of renewed polemics. And in that piece, I was particularly concerned that, and this is really going to be my focus today. My focus today is how this tale has been told over the years, and especially the claim to special veracity by the protagonist himself, Edgardo Mortara, and his account of this event. Reverend Cesario, in his piece, suggested that my book, the account of my book, was tendentious. He writes, if Catholics are to respond effectively to David Kertzer's allegations in the kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, evaluation of Pope Pius IX's actions should be based on the most accurate detailing of the facts that political, legal, and religious history can provide. What he suggests is the most accurate detailing of the facts, in his words, comes from publication just this past fall of an English edition of the memoirs written by Edgardo Mortara himself in the 1880s when he was a member of the Canons Regular, a priest. And I'll later turn to this text, but first I'd like to put this matter in a larger historical framework. One of the key elements of the Mortara controversy from the very beginning has been around the facts of the case. There's not been an agreement on the facts. You can argue about, was it a good decision, a bad decision by Pius IX, and so forth, but what actually happened? This remains a matter of controversy. Say, one of the most famous depictions, this was done by a German Jewish painter a couple of years after the the taking in 1858 of the child. And this is also a scene that never took place either, but we can talk about that later. In my book, I describe how from the very beginning, from the day that Edgardo was taken from his home in Bologna in 1858, two competing narratives of the events were spread by partisans on each side. Partisans, defenders of the church at the time and of Pius IX, told of a boy who within hours of being taken from his home had the holy effects of the baptism that he had allegedly undergone work its wonders, so that as the policeman was taking him to the Casa dei Catecumeni, the House of the Catechumens, the church institution for converting the Jews in Rome to which he was being taken, the child begged to stop at every church practically on the way so that he could go and pray to the Madonna. In this church narrative, when Edgardo's parents came to visit him in the House of the Catechumens, he begged the rector, the priest in charge, to keep them away, keep his parents away, saying he felt threatened by them. On the other hand, the narrative that quickly appeared in the liberal press and the Jewish press told of a small child who was violently torn from his father's arms, who went screaming and crying in the police wagon. A child whose parents, when they visited him in the House of the Catechumens to which he was taken in Rome, begged them tearfully not to return to Bologna without taking him to return to see his brothers and sisters and to be with his family. The logic behind Reverend Cesario's premise seems on the face of it to be strong. That is his premise. I didn't mention this. The article, Non Possumus, that he wrote earlier this year was based on a review of the publication last fall of the memoir written, as I mentioned, of Edgardo Mortara himself as an adult. And what Cesario argues is that there can be no more accurate source for telling the story than the protagonist himself. And there's some, would seem on the face of it, some logic to this. What apparently neither Father Cesario nor the editors of Ignatius Press, the press in San Francisco that published the English edition, so the original edition of this was published by Vittorio Messori. Vittorio Messori is a very prominent conservative Catholic journalist in Italy. He co-authored a couple of books with popes, Benedict and John Paul II. And he, in response to the Italian publication of my book, published 15 or so years ago, the Italian edition that he presents as the memoirs of Edgardo Mortara. It was this now that was published in English translation just this past fall, occasioning this article in First Things. What apparently neither Father Cesario nor the editors of the press, Ignatius Press, realized is that this edition was a heavily doctored one. It actually isn't the original writing of then Father Mortara, since he became a monk. And if anybody's interested, I'm not going to go into much the way in which this was doctored. I did a piece that appeared in The Atlantic in April that recounts some of the way that this happened. But let's assume for a minute that what had been published and what was reviewed by Father Cesario was the accurate English translation of this memoir. He wrote the memoir while he was at a monastery in Spain, Edgardo Mortara, who was said to give sermons in 7 different languages, and he wrote it in Spanish. So the English version, strangely, was a translation not from the original Spanish, but from the Italian translation that Messori had prepared. But let's assume that, in fact, this book was an accurate version, accurate translation of what Mortara had written. How should we view the facts presented by the protagonist himself? Indeed, from early on, Edgardo became one of the main composers of the narrative of what had happened to him as a young age. he would base much of his career in traveling around from country to country, telling the inspiring story of how divine grace shined upon him in this Jewish family and how he was plucked out and found the true path. One of the earliest indications we have of the story that Edgardo would craft of his redemption from his Jewish family comes in a letter he wrote to Pius IX in 1871 on the 25th anniversary of the Pope's pontificate. The artist's rendition, actually, I think he like Dominicans, wore a white robe, not a black robe, but this is how an artist in one of the Catholic press depicted Edgardo at around this age. There, in this letter that he writes for the 25th anniversary to the Pope, he tells the Pope of his great gratitude to him. He writes, "I know very well, and others know too, all I owe to you," to the Pope, "for freeing me from the insanities of the synagogue. But God's enemies, who are the enemies of yours and mine, saw in this only a reason for attacking your holiness with violent furor, to injure you, to scorn you, to insult you. And so the most noble and heroic actions came to be made to look bad and reciprocated with the cruelest and most vile sarcasms." It says Pius IX at about that age. Mortara then went on to blast the founders of the new Italian state, which had only the year before seized Rome from the Pope and put an end to what was left of the papal states that existed for 1,000 years. He referred to them as the perverted, iniquitous, foolish liberators of Italy who know not what they are doing, and he told the Pope that the nation would, quote, "be infinitely happier and more pleased to remain under his rule." Accounts of the sermons Mortara gave in his far-flung travels in the last decades of the 19th century, and which he, as I mentioned, gave in 6 or 7 different languages, including most notably perhaps Basque. I think these offer some insight. By the way, I discussed none of this in my book, so in preparing for this talk today, it was interesting for me to try to track down some of these sermons that he was giving in these years. He gave us a series of sermons during Lent in 1897 in Venice's now underwater San Marco Basilica, and he subsequently had them published as a booklet. He waited till the end of the last of this series of sermons to recount his personal tale. Let me just give you a little taste of what he's told people then. It's 1897. "I will end by satisfying your legitimate curiosity. I was baptized by a young Catholic girl when I was still a child and gravely ill, living in the bosom of my Jewish family. 6 years later," so these events, the alleged baptism took place when he was 12 months old. It was only when he was 6 that he's taken away. 6 years later, the fact came to light, and Pope Pius IX, faithful to the tenets of divine law, believed it his duty to place me under his tutelage in the heavenly nectar of Catholic truth. Much noise was made in my name and about my baptism. Pius IX had to suffer much at the hands of the great and the little, as he used to say. But he remained firm, and firm I remained as well, firm in the grace that accompanied me. To all the temptations, the caresses, the flatteries of my relatives and strangers, I responded, "I am Christian and I want to die a Christian." As part of his efforts to use his inspiring story not only to convert the Jews, but also to bring wayward Catholics back into the fold, Edgardo traveled later that same year, 1897, to the United States. He was hosted shortly after his landing with a sympathetic group of Catholics and priests in Brooklyn, Italian Americans. But he was eager to meet the Archbishop. And so he rushes within a few days of arriving in New York to meet the Archbishop, Archbishop Corrigan, of course, at the time he was Irish, not Italian. And he wanted to get authorization and financial support from the Archbishop to set up a mission to the Italian, the large, of course, at the time, 1897, Italian immigrant community in New York. So what does Archbishop Corrigan have to say to him? Well, we now find in one of the archives of one of the congregations of Propaganda Fide in Rome, the letter that Archbishop Corrigan sends to the Cardinal Ledachowski, who's head of that congregation. He sends it within a couple of days of having met with Edgardo Mortara. And he writes it because, why does Corrigan write? Well, at the time, the American Catholic community comes under the responsibility of that congregation of Propaganda Fide, propaganda of the faith in Rome. And he was worried that others might cast him, that is the Archbishop, in a negative light for what he told Edgardo. So this is what he's trying to stave off. So he explains in writing to the Cardinal Ledachowski in Rome, he said, as Reverend Mortara is in the hands of these 3 or 4 priests in Brooklyn, whose sympathies I do not enjoy, I have reason to suspect that some report will be sent either to the Vatican or to the Sacred Congregation of Propaganda Fide regarding the matter. For this reason, he writes, it is best that your most reverend eminence knows the true state of affairs. This letter, written by the Archbishop of New York, December 17th, 1897, I think is worth quoting at some length. Your Eminence, he writes, this is an extract from the letter, not the full one, but the priest, Edgardo Levi Mortara, well known in Europe and beyond, arrived within the past few days in New York. He came to visit me and spoke to me of establishing missions for Italians and preaching in the churches of the city and outside it. I did not think it opportune to grant him the necessary permission, for I know from experience that it is very difficult to establish Italian missions, and I know how difficult it is to keep those already existing going. However, there was more. In addition, said the Archbishop, I do not think it prudent for Reverend Mortara to go around preaching here and there, because the Jewish colony of New York is quite powerful, both in political influence and in wealth, and it has friendly relations with Catholics. If the above-mentioned priests were permitted to go around preaching, not only would the old stories end up being repeated in the newspapers, which would produce such a great outcry and make such a bad impression in America to the detriment of the church, but moreover, the Catholics would lose the sympathy and the support of the Jewish colony, which would certainly not look kindly on the granting of such a privilege to such a priest. He, by the way, concludes maybe defensively by saying before he took his action, he discussed the matter with the apostolic delegate to the US in Washington, who agreed with him. At the time, you know, the US didn't have diplomatic relations with the Holy See, and so the US did not have an ambassador at the time to the Holy See in Rome, and so there was not a nuncio, but there was an apostolic delegate here. A couple of weeks, if I had, well, show this. A couple of weeks after the New York Archbishop wrote his letter, Edgardo himself penned a letter, again offering himself as the definitive source of an accurate account of his story. Mortara's letter was occasioned by one he had received by a Jewish man from Louisville named Isaac Feibel, who wrote to him after reading Gretz's now classic, then new History of the Jews, the account of the Mortara case in the History of the Jews. Feibel was apparently troubled by Gretz's statement that Edgardo had learned to, that being brought up in the ways of Catholicism, he learned to curse his parents and his race. So he was found in the first edition, anyway, of the Gretz account of the Mortara case. As you see here, this is the actual letter that Edgardo Mortara wrote to Feibel that we have in a Jewish archive in New York now. As you see there, Mortara writes, "You will readily admit that I am the person spoken of in Gretz's History of the Jews. I can be more truly relied upon to give the particulars of my life than those whose minds were doubtlessly biased by Jewish prejudices. I was born in Bologna, Italy, where there existed a law forbidding the employment of Christian servants by those of the Jewish faith. This law of the state my parents violated and had naturally to suffer the consequences. It was not against my wish that I left my home, knowing full well that a refusal to do so would be a resistance to law and authority." He was 6 years old at the time. Pius IX was king of Italy, and in carrying out the above-named law to its logical consequences, wrote Edgardo, he was acting with all due authority, as has been testified to in the High Court of Bologna in 1859. Against the calumnious and offensive statements made by Gretz that I learned to curse my parents, I must solemnly protest. And on the contrary, I assure that I have always, he wrote this letter in English, I assure I have always had the deepest and most devoted attachment for them, his parents, never forgetting that Jesus Christ, the true Messiah, never abolished the 10 Commandments of God. Having been rebuffed by the Archbishop of New York, Mortara began a several months long tour and kind of sermonizing through many cities of the Northeast United States, including all the way to Chicago. And he, of course, again recounts his story of his own redemption. In Philadelphia in March, for example, so we're now in March 1898, Mortara gives an interview to the local Philadelphia Catholic newspaper. That the world was still paying attention is evident from the fact that I first saw this reported, not actually in the Philadelphia Catholic newspaper where it originally appeared, but republished in the Semaine Religieuse, the weekly publication of the Diocese of Lyon in France. And they introduced the article and this interview with Edgardo, now in Lyon, France, by saying, here finally is the source for the true account of what had happened to Edgardo Mortara. And as they put it, this is what he tells the reporter of the Catholic Standard who asked him for the true story of his entry into the Catholic Church as opposed to the imaginary fiction given by Jewry and accredited by all of the world's masonry. This is a view of Edgardo at about this time. He's a few years later, but more or less. Interestingly, he's holding a picture of his mother in this picture. In his Philadelphia interview, after telling his story of what led the servant to baptize him, he asserted that in the weeks before the papal police seized him, before the papal police came, word of his baptism had already spread. And he says, when I learned that I was Catholic, a strange impulse, this is saying that while he learned he was Catholic while he's living with his parents, a strange impulse took hold of me, and I desired not to remain any longer in my parents' home, wanting to receive a Catholic education. My parents were practicing Jews and did not want to listen to me. And he continues, I was then only 7 years old, it's actually 6, and the laws of the Papal States forced me to comply with my parents' wishes. Okay, so there's this whole story he's telling about before he's actually taken by the police. He's learned that somehow learned that he's been baptized and asked his parents that he wants to now become Catholic and wants to leave them. It was not long before the Pope heard my exceptional case spoken of and of my parents' energetic opposition. He invited, that is, the Pope invited them to end this opposition. He insisted, saying that since I had been baptized, he was obliged to take care of my Catholic education. In this period, the temporal power of the Pope was at its full extent. My parents acquiesced. I went to Rome, but I was not, as it was said at the time, forced to do so. Mortara continues his story, saying that his parents then came to Rome in an unsuccessful attempt to get him back. And he recalls that a friend of the family was with them for his interview their interview with him in the House of the Catechumens, trying to convince him using, and the friend of the family used this argument, this is now Mortara's words, about what the friend of the family was saying. The fourth commandment commands you to obey your father and your mother. To which Mortara says he replied, he's now maybe just short of his 7th birthday. He says he replied, quote, there are 3 other commandments that relate to my duties to God. And so he stood firm. Hammering the point home, the French Catholic article ended by citing the conclusion of the Philadelphia Catholic publication. These are, quote, the declarations made by the young Mortara, now around 50 years old. He is certainly more credible when he speaks of that which regards him than all the anti-Catholic journals gathered in one Masonic whole. In fact, much of Mortara's account of what happened to him is pure fiction. The story of his learning of his baptism weeks before the police arrived is an invention, as of course is his account of his desire to leave his parental home to become Catholic. The scene of his arguments with his parents over his desire to leave home is fictitious, as his entire description of the Pope's efforts to convince his parents to let him go. The moving scene of the family friend citing the 10 Commandments and obey your father and your mother, this too is invented. There was no way that the papal authorities at the time would allow a friend of the family to accompany them. It was already the parents to see him. It was already unprecedented to allow Jewish parents to see their child who had been taken in circumstances like this, as many Jewish children had been over the decades and previous centuries. We know all this. We know this is all fiction, thanks to the several hundred pages of testimony of these events taken in early 1860 as part of the trial of the Inquisitor on charges of kidnapping Edgardo. Recall that about a year after Edgardo was taken, he's taken in June 1858. So June 1859 is the beginning of the end of the Papal States, and Bologna rebels against the papal authorities. The Cardinal Legate is driven out of town, and the new authorities take over. Virtually the first person they arrest is the Dominican Inquisitor of Bologna, Father Felletti, charged with kidnapping Edgardo. So and the way the trial operated was by a series of interviews with all the principals. So we have 700 pages of testimony, dozens and dozens of pages of testimony by the Inquisitor himself, by the father, the mother, the policeman who went to the home and seized him, and so on, and others. We also have many hundreds of contemporaneous documents of the case found in the Vatican secret archives, as well as the historical archives of the Grand Temple of the Synagogue of Rome. I've digitized all these, so I have thousands and thousands of pages of archival documents digitized right here in Providence. A decade after Mortara's visit to the US, Catholic journals in Europe were still reporting his own inspiring first-person accounts of his story. A long account in the 1908 bulletin of the French missionary group dedicated to the conversion of the Jews avidly reported on Mortara's latest telling of the story. This is 1908. Began by emphasizing the huge impact that the taking of the little boy had on the fate of the church. Although the Pope was acting in accordance with church and civil law at the time, which of course were one and the same in the Papal States, the journal explained, quote, the enemies of the Pope were looking for a pretext to take away his crown and his temporal domains. This incident accelerated the evolution of political events, and the princes rising up against the Lord and against his Christ provoked the people to break the yoke of the pontifical theocracy, unquote. This is the French missionary bulletin. They then returned to Mortara's own account, which he gave using the third person, in recollecting his early encounters with the Pope after his arrival in Rome. So this, again, they're quoting from Mortara's account. Sometimes seeing the boy at his feet, the innocent cause of the uprising of hell, the pontiff cried out amidst his tears, Do you see this child here? The great and the small wanted to tear his soul away from me, but I said to all, no, I cannot, non possumus. To surrender a soul would be a great crime, unquote. And so reported Mortara, recollecting after half a century these scenes in his first weeks in Rome, quote, neither the tender entreaties of my dear parents nor the most attractive promises succeeded because grace never abandoned me. My response was always the same. I am Christian. If my parents would only become Christian too, then I would return to my family. All right, let me just turn in the moments I have left to the most recent polemics. I thought it was important, though, to give you this historical context, which I don't provide in my book, which really focused on the events themselves and not what happened subsequently. Even before Steven Spielberg's announcement of his plan to make a film based on my book, which hopefully one day will be made, but keeps being postponed. Alfred Urey's play, which was based on my book, Alfred Urey wrote Miss Daisy and other well-known theatrical works, and wrote a play based on my book that was put on a couple of times a number of years ago. All this provoked an angry reaction from some of the usual suspects among defenders of the Church of Pius IX, which I read as defenders of the church before it took a wrong turn with the Second Vatican Council. In a piece titled Fact or Fiction, It's Catholic Bashing All the Same, the Catholic League reacted to my book and the play by charging, quote, whether it's based on fact or fiction or whether it's portrayed on the stage or on the screen, the Catholic bashers are a busy lot these days. They are as good at twisting the facts as they are at developing fictional accounts. Truth doesn't matter. What matters is results, unquote. A similar script has been followed by the many bloggers of a similar persuasion in reacting more recently to Spielberg's announcement of the planned film. Just give you a flavor of this. One writes, the Mortara case is the Catholic blog of Dallas, or this is how they present it anyway. The Mortara case fell into obscurity shortly after the initial hubbub, except within Jewish circles, where it remained a cause célèbre. It was obscure, that is, until the anti-Catholic Jewish historian David Kertzer published a book many feel is badly biased on the subject in 1997. Kertzer has written other hateful screeds alleging that Catholic popes, didn't know there were other kinds, played a significant role, it's like Jewish rabbis we've seen recently, the popes played a significant role in the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe in the 19th and 20th centuries, and also in the rise of fascism in the 20s and 30s. I could multiply examples, well, I think I have, to give you a little bit of ideas. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with some of these conservative Catholic sites, however you want to label them. It's fake news. This was before Trump, actually. Or here, further on their site. There are quite a few sites like this. It's from this conservative matrix within the church, identified, of course, with opponents of Pope Francis, that the publication of what is represented as Mortara's own memoirs sprang. It's an Italian language publication in 2002, as I referred to earlier, by Vittorio Messori. As I mentioned, co-authored books, well, they say co-authored, he's presented co-authored, basically they were interviews with Pope Benedict and Pope John Paul II. But when Vittorio Messori published the Italian version of Edgardo Mortara's memoir, it received little press outside of Italy, although in Italy actually it got a lot of press. I think that's the cover of the Italian version of the book. He offered the book as a direct response to my own, again claiming that the account he was publishing by Mortara himself would offer a fully accurate story. In an interview in Italy's leading newspaper, Il Corriere della Sera, following his book's Italian publication, Mussolini criticized those of us who had not relied on Mortara's account, saying that we ignored it, quote, because the true Mortara, not the one used as a polemical weapon, never mattered to anyone. Yet, dismissing what attempts to be as accurate an account of the events as a historian can achieve on the grounds that it does not take Mortara's own account as the gold standard is to fail to recognize the fact that Mortara's own account is as partisan as any. As I mentioned earlier, in my recent Atlantic article, I detailed both the ways in which Mussolini doctored what Mortara actually did write in the text that Ignatius Press recently published, and about the ways in which what Mortara's text does say misrepresents its history. So I won't repeat that here. But just to give you one example, for those who may not have been following these polemics closely, let me refer to the way Ignatius Press has been advertising Mussolini's book that was published just last fall. The English publication last fall. And as you see there, and this is from the catalog copy, which they also, for the book, if you go, I don't know whether they've now taken it down. Actually, if there's time later, we could talk about, apparently Ignatius Press is quite embarrassed by some aspects of what has been brought to light, but so I'm not sure they still have this as their catalog copy online. But as you see there, they write, after several failed attempts to persuade his parents to enroll him in a local Catholic school, in 1858, Pope Pius IX had the boy taken from his family in Bologna and sent to a Catholic boarding school in Rome. But as I've mentioned before, this is all invention. It never happened. In this case, not a distortion of Mussolini, but invented by Mortara himself later. As you can imagine, I found these continuing attacks on my Mortara book to be upsetting, but I believe that they may also be evidence of something more important than my own ruffled feathers. When the Italian edition of my Mortara book came out 2 decades ago, it was reviewed in L'Avvenire, which is some of you may be familiar with, the daily newspaper published by the Catholic Church hierarchy in Italy. So it's the official paper of the Catholic hierarchy in Italy. If you go to Mass on Sunday, often there'll be stacks of them handed out. It published a review after the Italian edition of my book came out, and I could not have been more pleased with the review. In fact, of all the reviews, it's the one I am happiest about. And I'd like to contrast how this story was viewed then with how these recent polemics, and I think this might be basis for some discussion. That review, they write, despite the notoriety of the case, the story of Edgardo Mortara had not, until today, been object of specialized studies. Kertzer reconstructs that event in a manner that carefully attends to the motives of both sides. The episode has been reconstructed with great finesse by David Kertzer, who recalls the great pain of the family, but also brings to light the strong personal tie that was established between Pius IX and the Jewish boy. The Pope kept him near him with paternal affection and closely followed the course of succeeding events. Kertzer's book reveals the capacity to analyze Catholic motives and behaviors that were truly not easy for the Jews to understand. And then in its final paragraph, the review sums up, in short, Kertzer's book efficaciously also shows how the historical analysis of painful events can contribute to promote a better reciprocal understanding between Christians and Jews. So I hesitate a bit to be so immodest as to quote a positive review like this, but I do find, especially its ending note, and given this meeting that this is my talk is part of councils of centers of Jewish-Christian understanding relations. What are we to make, though, of this contrast between how the book was received by the Italian church official community at the time it came out and the controversy today. Are there forces now acting within the Catholic Church in opposition to Pope John Paul II's plea in the millennial year of 2000 for the Church and what he referred to as the sons and daughters of the Church to come to what he called a clear-eyed understanding of the Church's past, including some of the more painful aspects of that past? Of course, there were always some in the Church who resented anyone, and here I think Catholic authors like Gary Wills and Jim Carroll, more than people like me, as being especially subject of hurtful invective, being attacked for what I regard as unflattering aspects of church historical reporting. But it's hard not to wonder whether the opponents of the sea change that the Second Vatican Council represented have not now taken up the Mortara case and fashioned it into a weapon to be used by those who see themselves as the defenders of the true church. Thank you.
David Kertzer's work not only provides the definitive historical account of a horrific injustice committed by the Church against a Jewish child, Edgardo Mortara, his family, and the Jewish community, but Kertzer's presentation today greatly assists Christians and Jews in determining fact from fiction in an enduring controversy that continues to grieve our Jewish brothers and sisters. According to Elena Mortara, the great-granddaughter of Edgardo's older sister, the incident remains, in her words, an open wound, something we still discuss at every Passover. In my response, I want to reinforce David's point about St. John Paul II's plea for Christians to come to a clear-eyed understanding of the past by briefly addressing what became for me one of the most difficult questions to emerge from David's work. That question is whether the revered 13th century theologian and doctor of the Church, St. Thomas Aquinas, taught that children baptized against the will of their parents must be removed in order to receive a Christian upbringing. Romanus Cesario cites Aquinas' theology in his January 2018 defense of the kidnapping of Mortara, and several scholars responded critiquing Cesario, also citing Aquinas, to argue against the kidnapping. But moreover, Aquinas' teaching was actually at the center of a rather extensive theological exchange between the Mortara family and the Vatican's Papal Council in 1858. Soon after Edgardo was abducted, the Mortara family, with the assistance of the Jewish community in Rome, produced and submitted to the Vatican a remarkable document that argued that the child must be returned because the Church, according to Aquinas, prohibits baptizing children of unbelievers without the consent of their parents. Aquinas functioned in the Mortara family document as the major authority. Yet, the Vatican's Papal Council also appealed to Aquinas' teaching in order to defend the decision to kidnap Edgardo from his parents. The council argued that even an unlawful baptism is nevertheless valid. And the Papal Council cited Aquinas' own text in the Summa Theologiae Secundae, question 10, article 12, where Aquinas' text does read, quote, "Now it would be an injustice to Jews if their children were to be baptized against their will, since they would lose their rights of parental authority over their children as soon as these were Christians." Based on this text, the Papal Council held that Aquinas teaches that Jewish parents lose their rights over their children if they are baptized. It seems Aquinas' theology does support Cesario's defense of Pius IX. However, the Papal Council's argument against the Mortara family is based on a misinterpretation of Aquinas. Aquinas must be as David had mentioned in his presentation, attended to with a clear-eyed attention to history. And so this means looking at the style and the structure of Aquinas' writing in the Summa Theologiae, which many Dominicans here can easily tell us about. That style and structure is based on the quaestio disputata, or disputed question. The style of writing was based on a medieval form of education that first considers both sides of a question and then the teacher's own answer. Aquinas explicitly addresses the question of whether or not Jewish children should be baptized against their parents' will in question 10, and there, written in 1271 or 1272, near the end of his life. He carefully lists the positions for and against before providing his own answer. First, he lists actual 13th century positions arguing for baptizing children of unbelievers against the will of their parents. Then, he lists one position on the other side, a position against forced baptism, which is the side he will take. He labels the argument that is on the side he will take as sed contra, or on the contrary. However, because the sed contra is the side of the debate that Aquinas argues for, it can easily be mistaken for his own position. Although he may agree with part of the sed contra, Aquinas' answer to a question is not in the sed contra. Aquinas decides to place the argument that it would be an injustice against the Jews to baptize their children since they would lose their parental rights, which is the text the Papal Council cites. Aquinas places that in the sed contra. It seems that this position was the preferred legal argument against forced baptism in the 13th century, as late as Innocent IV. Therefore, when the Papal Council cites the text from the sed contra as Aquinas' answer, it is not Aquinas' position. And this means their argument is based on a proof text. The sed contra expresses the preferred legal argument of the day against forced baptism of Jewish children, and Aquinas' position is similar to this, but it is also in important ways different. Aquinas' position is similar in that he is also against the hideous practice of forced baptism, and he views it as a grave injustice against Jewish people. However, his answer is different in that he defends the rights of Jewish parents by saying that parental custody is part of the natural law, or the moral law, and that baptism requires human consent. In his answer, entitled the Respondio, Aquinas argues, quote, that the very great authority of the custom of the Church is against forced baptism of non-Christian children. Aquinas argues that children do not have the use of reason and thus cannot consent to baptism. Before the child has the use of reason, it can be baptized only if parents will this. He says, quote, before it has the use of its free will, a child is enfolded in the care of its parents, which is like a spiritual womb. That a child is in the care of its parents is a part of the natural order. Once the child reaches the age of reason, it can then consent to the faith. For the same reason that the will of the adult must be respected in baptism, the will of the child before reason, which is implied by parents, must also be respected. In other places, Aquinas teaches that conversion requires will and intent. Indeed, the idea of a forced conversion would be incoherent from Aquinas' perspective, since conversion presupposes the freedom of the will. Not only is forced baptism of children of unbelievers contrary to the natural law, if a child, before coming to the use of reason, Aquinas says, were to be taken away from its parents' custody or anything done to it against its parents' wish, this would also be against the natural law. The Papal Council's reply to the Mortara family also ignores the rest of Aquinas' teaching, which includes his refutation of 5 different theological and legal arguments for forced baptism, some of which were articulated by French Dominicans in his day, and which resemble theological arguments made by Cesario. Indeed, Aquinas even rejects the argument that an infant should be baptized against the will of its parents in order to save it from spiritual death, an idea that has now been codified in canon law in the 1983 Code. Aquinas considered these arguments as dangerous innovations in discontinuity with the custom of the church and in injustice against Jewish parental rights. That Aquinas was fighting against these views in the late 13th century, and he addressed forced baptism 3 different times in his work, indicates that there were a number of rather sophisticated legal and theological arguments circulating in the middle of the 12th century that sought to override Jewish parental rights. I do not think Catholic theologians have adequately addressed the dark history of forced conversion, but Kertzer's work provides excellent inroads into the history of the problem in the early modern era. The Mortara family and the Roman Jewish community, when they argue that forced baptism of children is invalid baptism precisely because it lacks intent of the parents, their argument, I misread that. The Mortara family and the Roman Jewish community that assisted in writing their document interprets Aquinas correctly when they argue that forced baptism of children is invalid baptism precisely because it lacks intent of the parents. Their argument, however, was up against an anti-Jewish legal apparatus that had already established forced conversions as standard policy despite Aquinas' teaching. Indeed, the same theological arguments in support of forced baptism of Jewish children that Aquinas argued against in 1271 would eventually breach the wall of the church's custom against this practice in the exceptions to the prohibition on forced baptism of Jewish children that was articulated by Pope Benedict XIV in 1747 and assumed by Pius IX in 1858. We are indebted to David Kertzer for helping us see the history of this particular incident with a clear-eyed view, and his work merits serious engagement beyond polemics. It merits the sort of engagement that's required, I think, of Jewish and Christian partners in scholarship. Thank you.
I want to begin with a brief word of thank you to Arthur Urbano, who has both worked tirelessly for years on this initiative and also given me my invitation to come this evening and speak. When this committee was first formed a number of years ago, I myself hoped fervently that we would be a community, that we would be a force for addressing difficult questions, not simply for gathering to try to note briefly common ground, but for addressing difficult history and difficult questions. And I think we have done that, but never more so than today, made all the more difficult, I must say, by the recent events in Pittsburgh. What I want to do in light of Professor Tapey's careful consideration of Aquinas, an interpretation which I will just say to which I am very sympathetic. There are complex questions here, but I think that he makes a case that absolutely can be made, and as you would agree, I think quite a shocking one to recognize at this moment, centuries after the case unfolded. I also want to say a word about the most recent history related to Father Cesario's essay, which appeared in January of this year. When that essay appeared, a number of us Catholic theologians who have been working on these questions for years found it deeply troubling, and many of us, myself included, immediately published opinions to that effect. Then, of course, being who we are, we began arguing among ourselves about why that would be the case, what would be the problem. So what I want to do is to step back and just outline for possible discussion some of the specific questions that were raised. First of all, the fundamental question about the legitimacy of this baptism was raised. Many people noting immediately some of the information that you just heard about Aquinas' position on the possibility not just of forced baptism in general, but of the baptism of Jewish children against the will of their parents, a question addressed specifically and more than once in Aquinas' work. I think that the tradition of the Catholic Church there is very clear. I will just note briefly, this is not exactly a scholarly point, just a point of kind of humanity, I suppose, in the history as it unfolded. We didn't get the facts exactly as they are laid out in Professor Kertzer's book. So just to reiterate, for anyone here who hasn't read the book or isn't following perfectly, trying to piece together the story, Edgardo Mortara was baptized, and I think these basic facts are undisputed. Edgardo Mortara was baptized at about a year old by a Catholic servant who worked in his parents' household. It is the case that technically it was long illegal, both for Catholics to work as servants in Jewish households and for from both ends, and for Jewish households to employ Catholic household help. But these Catholic nurses and maids were what have sometimes been called Sabbath Gentiles. They were able to assist the household during Sabbath times. And I will just say this. And then to continue the story, that baptism was revealed by that nurse some years later, and then the reality seemed to rise to the surface that what we had was a Jewish child who had been baptized and in fact made into a Christian child. But I will just say this, again, a human point perhaps rather than a scholarly point. And I'll come back to it at the end of my remarks here. The belief, of course, of the Catholic Church is in the power of the sacraments. Now, it's important to note, as has already been noted, that the will is also involved in the workings of the sacraments, not just baptism, but others in important ways. However, in Catholic communities, it is, for example, common practice. I just offer this to you as background. It is common practice that if one is in that community in the presence of an unbaptized person who may be facing death imminently, it is right for a lay person to baptize the one in mortal danger. That was true then, and that is still true now in practicing families. I know many people who have done that. I know family members who have baptized an infant born in danger of death. So the motivation there, of course, on the part of the Catholic nurse is her concern about the imminent death of the child. And I just have to say here, I recently had a theological conversation on exactly the same topic with a grandmother who was going to visit her Catholic grandmother, Catholic grandchildren. And she came to me because I'm a theologian, and she was certainly going to carry this small bottle of holy water in her purse. And the question was, would it be wrong in a household in which her children were not being raised in the faith, would it be wrong to quietly baptize them if she had the opportunity to do that? And of course I had to say, no, that wouldn't be quite the right way to go about it. So that's the first question, was the baptism right to do? Now there's a second question that has been raised because some people have, in disagreement with the commentary that you just heard, held that the baptism was in fact valid. So that then, although the original act was unjust, there is a state in which you have a Christian child. I need to say quickly, just because none of us have said it yet, that at the moment of the Mortara case, both civil and canon law required the Christian education of a Christian child. So some taking this view have assumed that the baptism was valid, and then it is simply a matter of rendering to that child his due of a Catholic education. I myself would side with the view here that Aquinas' position is certainly best understood as extending the injustice of the baptism, and in fact, the undermining of the baptism as sacrament extends here to undermine the right to remove the child. But let me note here that there is a sub-point that has to be considered. And again, I'll come back to this at the end of my remarks. An important question, I think. Among Christian theologians, a number have asked, not only was it licit, was it right to remove this child? That's not the only question that can be asked. The other question is it right to employ the power of the state? It is possible, of course, theoretically, that you could believe that such a thing should happen, but be unwilling, but assume that the church should not, in fact, use the power of secular coercion, really, in order to effect that outcome. The third thing that has been debated among Christian theologians is how and whether the Jewishness of the family matters here. Now, I think you can see, if you're following the logic of the syllogism, in a certain technical, logical sense, the removal of this child, the kidnapping, I should say, of this child, was carried out not precisely because of the Jewishness of the parents. In other words, it would have been, we would hold that logically it should have been in place, whatever the religious beliefs of the parents, if they were not Christian. They were unable to provide the Christian education. I will say, though, that I, along with others, have argued that that hardly does justice to the long reality of the history of Jewish minorities living under Christian rule, and that we have to see this case as very much a part of a long series of forms of injustice that Jews have endured. I said that I would circle back around, and here's the question that the issue that I want to add at the end. We haven't mentioned it at all yet. And it's in response specifically to Professor Kertzer's implied question, why now? And especially, what's the difference 20 years on, the publication of the book? He noted, for example, certain divisions in the church that have begun to appear around the pontificate of Pope Francis. I think that may be possible, but I want to offer an alternate theory for our consideration. The question could be put like this: why is Father Cesario interested in noting the testimony of Edgardo Mortara? What does it prove? Does it, for example, justify the Holy Father in this action? Well, I think the answer to that question is clearly no, it does not. There is no possibility to simply revert to the ends justifying the means in Catholic theology. But there's another theory, another hypothesis that the testimony might prove. And that is simply the sacramental, supernatural power of the baptism. Now, why would that be important? And why would it be more important now, 20 years later, than it was when the book was published? Well, it could be for this reason. Father Cesario writes, and all of us live at a moment, I think it is undeniable, of increasing secularization. And so he has a deep investment in maintaining and even pointing to evidence of the power of the sacrament beyond, you can see in this case, beyond all natural explanation. So my contention would be this. That is a conviction that is well worth considering. Interestingly enough, it was not something that precisely will divide Jews and Christians. In fact, it's a question on which both Christians and certainly religious Jews find themselves pressed, find themselves concerned. How is it that a community that is frankly founded in belief in God, how is it that such a community and the individuals in that community can survive in a context in which that belief is reviled or even undermined? So in the end, although I believe that Father Cesario accomplished a serious misstep in his essay, nevertheless, I believe that there is a question that is raised that is worth it for all of us to ask and to ask together.
I think what I'd like to do is open things up for your questions or comments, because realizing we only have 15 minutes and suspecting many people might have such questions or comments, because I could go on for another 15 minutes. These very useful, incisive remarks that we've just heard, but why don't we at least start things that way? Yes.
I'll just say it very quickly again, if you don't mind.
Please.
I'm Professor Holly Taylor Coolman. I teach here at Providence College. I'm a Catholic theologian teaching here. And Professor Matthew Tapie is also a Catholic theologian at St. Leo University in Florida.
Yes.
I have sort of a Jewish question, Catholic question. One is, historically, is there any evidence that the boy had a Brit Milah or a ritual circumcision, and did that come up at all as to what the intention of the parents might have been? And the Catholic part of that is, in terms of saying that if a child is near death, they can be, as I understood it, can be baptized or christened. If the child does not die, does that have an effect on whether or not it's a kosher baptism?
Yeah, well, yes, I mean, Edgardo was certainly circumcised, and the family was fairly observant, so that was never came into question. I think what we've heard about, there's this theological distinction at the time, certainly, and has a long history, between what's a licit baptism and what's a valid baptism. As we've heard from these theologians, this was a case that was regarded, basically, the controversy was whether, or at least from the church point of view at the time, whether it was licit, that in any case it was regarded as valid, because even from the church point of view, at least at the time, if a valid baptism simply required the proper intent, that is, a serious intent, and the pronouncement of a very simple ritual. And for the rest, it really, for a child, now we're talking about a child under the age, didn't matter. So a lot of the documents that went from the Mortara family and the Jewish community on behalf of the Mortara family to get Edgardo freed, insofar as it regarded whether it was licit, baptism was regarded at the time as really neither here nor there, because whether it was licit or not, if the proper formula was followed in the serious intent, the child should be regarded as having a valid baptism.
May I also add something? The licitness, though, of the baptism was also an important issue, because the canon law up until Benedict the 14th in 1747 did not specify that one could illicitly baptize an infant in vitis parentibus against the will of the parents if they are near death. So when Benedict the 14th codifies that into his letters and issues them, he establishes then that essentially what I would say is a forced baptism becomes canon. And it sets the stage for what happens with Edgardo Mortara.
I can report briefly that it's not required that you die in order for your baptism to be efficacious. But I should just say more clearly, such a practice assumes not only a family but a community that desires on behalf of the child that baptism, and the assumption is that simply time has suddenly run out, so the ritual should be performed.
Also, one last thing. Sorry, the canon, the letters that Benedict XIV issued do not specify what near death means, and so it was left up to the Christian baptizer to decide, which you can of course imagine would lead to abuses. So in some ways, some of these regulations and stipulations were for the purpose specifically of providing opportunities. Unfortunately, so the intense desire to see conversions, it's hard to understand how intense that it was in that period.
Yes.
Okay, there are two bits here. The Mortara case was part of a decades-long, a centuries-long practice in Rome, in the Papal States and in Rome. It didn't finish there though, because we see it playing out again in the 20th century in the Finale affair, and it's the same kind of interpretation and misinterpretation of Thomas that gets deployed, and then in France, and then the other piece of this is, Holly, when you referenced the possibility that this may be actually a symbolization of the struggle with secularism. One of the things that I find, and I don't know whether you were thinking about this, but Jews, at least since the 19th century, have been almost symbolized as the agents of the secular in some of the debates among Christians as a whole and among Catholics certainly. And I'm wondering if that is part of what's going on, not necessarily consciously, but presenting a risk in front of us.
I hadn't thought of it in that way. That'd be a really interesting, a hypothesis to consider further. I'll just say it this way. I almost feel as if the razor-sharp poignancy of this case on the human level almost allowed it to serve as a kind of test case for the primacy of the supernatural, if you see what I mean. That's how I've thought about it, that it's a sort of perfect moment at which to assert unwavering belief in sacramental power, in God's action, because at this moment it goes against certainly human sentiment easily, that it especially serves well for that purpose. So
I think it is framed in such a way like that the secularism issue is good to raise because it does highlight for us one of the concerns in Cesario's piece is that church and synagogue should be united around God and not the secular world. The secular world is our enemy. This world versus church, world versus synagogue dichotomy, I think is foreign to Christianity, to the heart of Catholicism, at least, because there's always been a tradition in the Catholic theological mind that the natural law is a common moral ground which we can believe we share with unbelievers. And so this common ground, I think, is important to recognize and to highlight that the world reflects God's wisdom, and natural rights and parental custody are part of those things. So in other words, God's presence is in the non-believer, and in many other ways, in lots of places, God cannot be simply reduced to this secular versus world. And I see that in Cesario's piece, and remarkably, you see it in the arguments in the 13th century. Thomas actually responds to some of the arguments, and they make the point that children should be offered up for baptism, because shouldn't you do that because God owns all things?
Now I'm just going to say a quick word in Father Cesario's defense, so take note here. I don't think his concern is church versus world or synagogue versus world. I believe his concern is church versus increasing secularized world, synagogue versus increasing secularized world, and the carving out of a God-free, for example, public square that he feels threatens both.
During the Holocaust, we know that there were desperate parents who would drop their children off at a convent to be protected. What happened to those children, especially if the parents were fortunate enough to survive and came back to pick up their child?
Well, there was a mention of the Finley case, which is of this type in France, but also Spain and Holland. There are a number of these cases, and in fact, in some cases, I'm sure the children were just handed, back to the relatives. Often it wasn't the parents who, in fact, had died, but an aunt and uncle comes back. And but within the last few years, there's been quite a bit of controversy about some cases where, when the relatives came back after the war, the church community, nuns or other church institutions resisted. And in some cases, in one case, the Archbishop of Paris, I think, became involved in finally getting the kid, liberated. But it does relate to this issue that the feeling on the part of at least some of the people in these religious communities was that, no, these children are now Christian and should not be returned to a Jewish family. Yeah, so that's what happened in many of these cases. Well, first of all, this is partly a history that still needs to be written. Thousands of Jews converted, beginning with the racial laws in 35, the Nuremberg laws, 38 in Italy and Hungary and elsewhere. So, there are also these kind of troubling issues of baptism through, you could call it a forced conversion, even of adults, because otherwise they thought they were about to be murdered. So this actually is in a way, a much larger issue. And, but the difference, it was referred to the question we heard before about the question of coercion. So it's one thing to say, from my theological point of view, you're now Christian, you're not Jewish anymore. But it's another to send a policeman to take the child and put them in another institution. Well, once the Papal States fell, this, for the most part, wasn't possible anymore. So it became a moot issue. So what however, had been the case for hundreds of years up to the Mortara case, and what's interesting about the Mortara case is these things have been happening many, many, many times, but they hadn't generated protests outside, very limited protests within the oppressed Jewish community, but not outside it. But things had changed enough with the fact that Jews had been liberated in other parts of Italy, had a Jewish press, the fact that in Papal States itself there was a movement for unification of Italy and the separation of church and state. This is what made the difference in the Mortara case.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah. Okay. Before the first of the questions, I just would like to thank the three panelists for a very clear and illuminating conversation. Ironically, it reminded me of a lot of Jewish legal discussion that I used to participate in the yeshiva circles. But I want to ask a point of clarification from Professor Tapie. And it may seem like it's a technical, arcane point, but it really goes to the nub of Rosario's argument, as I understood it.
We're theologians. We live for technical arguments.
Oh, okay. Well, may the Lord protect you, if that's the case. No, but in all seriousness, it's as I read Rosario, even he conceded that the baptism was illicit ante facto. In other words, his argument was that, well, maybe it shouldn't have been done, but post facto, after it was done, however illicit it was, it is efficacious and it is valid, and baptism has a certain metaphysical, supernatural power, so that even when done illicitly, it cannot be reversed, and that fact, is what coerced Pius IX, to take Mortara. And it seemed to me that the quotes that you brought from Aquinas pertain to the ante facto situation rather than the post facto situation. Forgive me if I misunderstood you, but that's what I heard. So could you clarify that?
Sure. It's a good point, and it's one that when you look at Aquinas' texts, he is not in agreement with many canonists. If we were to argue that from Aquinas, as I did, that baptism, forced baptism, would be invalid, this would not be the opinion of many canonists. If you look at the Council of Toledo 4, Canon 60, this is where the idea that the child should be removed and given a Christian upbringing actually emerges from. So there's already a precedent there in the canon law that addresses, that basically sets a standard that's quite unfortunate. It's not always enforced, but it was enforced.
Notice I say the argument can be made. I think it could be argued against as well. Of course, many of us, for a wide variety of other reasons at this present moment, come to this conclusion. But certainly in the abstract, theoretically, just from Aquinas' text, you could argue, as they did, But I would, yeah, the case could be made as it was just made to you.
If a mother does not have a listed religion and her baby is being born with multiple deformities not compatible with life, does it make any difference whether that child is baptized?
From the Catholic perspective, I would say yes. I think it's important for children to be baptized with the will of the parents.
The mother is asleep from anesthesia. The baby is going to die within a few minutes.
Right. The current canon says that someone must be present to express the will.
No one is present.
This whole conversation, if I may say, about canonicity is overlooking the fact that the Catholic Church no longer believes that unbaptized children are going to hell. And that is the presupposition that drove all of these kinds of casuistic considerations about what happens if the child dies before they're baptized, and what happens if the mother is unconscious and can't give consent. It may be that our canon law has not caught up with our theology in terms of understanding how God's grace operates outside the Catholic Church, which prior to when was a rather limited and restricted community. It was a very exclusivist. I don't know what I've been.
Sure.
I don't think canon law is the sole determiner of issues.
Thank you, Phil. I think that's helpful to contextualize. This is a contemporary period is very different. For instance, even the canon that does say currently, the 1983 Code canon law that mentions that children can be baptized against the will of the parents, before that 83 Code was finalized, it went through revisions that actually dropped that language out of the canon, and it changed it, and then it was added back in. So the whole process of it being there right now, I think it's actually a remnant of Benedict XIV's edicts.
Okay, well, would you join me in thanking Professor Kertzer and our other panelists? Just some logistical notes before we head out. So for the CCJR members and for the invited guests, the reception will now be held in Aquinas Hall, which is outside of this building. That's right. We're going to head into Aquinas now. But my colleagues, Rick Barry, Rick, could you put up your hand here, and Daria Spezzano, and myself will help lead you over to Aquinas. And then for the CCJR members, dinner will be at 7 back in this building just next door. If we could start gathering maybe around 6:50 and start heading over then.